There is a peculiar kind of love that doesn't break you all at once. It teaches you to doubt yourself slowly. It begins with a spark that feels rare, almost poetic, as if you found someone who lives just beyond the ordinary rules of connection. They draw you in with quiet intensity, with moments that feel meaningful yet never quite complete. And before you realize it, you are no longer standing firmly in your own emotions. You are reading between silences, holding onto fragments, trying to make sense of something that refuses to fully reveal itself. Tonight, we are not just talking about love, we are uncovering a pattern, a rhythm, a series of stages that many have lived through, but few have been able to name. And once you see it clearly, you will never mistake confusion for connection again. In the beginning, it rarely feels like something is missing. In fact, it feels like you have discovered something rare, someone who doesn't rush, someone who holds back just enough to make every moment feel earned. Their distance does not alarm you. It intrigues you. It feels like depth, like there is a story beneath the surface, waiting patiently to be understood. And so you lean in, not with fear, but with curiosity, believing that what is quiet must also be meaningful. There is a certain beauty in how it starts. Conversations come in waves, not constants. Their presence arrives like a soft wind, gentle, refreshing, but never quite staying long enough to settle. And instead of questioning the gaps, you begin to romanticize them. You tell yourself that this is what makes it special, that not everything needs to be loud to be real. You convince your heart that what is rare must also be right. But slowly, almost invisibly, something shifts within you. You begin to wait, not just for messages or moments, but for clarity, for consistency, for something that feels steady enough to stand on. Yet every time you get close to asking for more, you remember how beautiful it felt in the beginning. The mystery, the space, the way it all seemed so different. And so, you silence your questions before they can fully form. What once felt like calm begins to feel like uncertainty, but by then, you are already emotionally invested. You hold on to the fragments you are given, stretching them into something whole, something that makes sense. You replay their words, searching for meaning, for reassurance hidden between lines that were never fully spoken. And the more you try to understand, the more you drift away from what you actually feel. There is a quiet cost to mistaking distance for depth. You begin to adjust yourself in ways you don't immediately notice. You become more patient than you need to be, more accepting of absence than your heart deserves. You start to believe that asking for presence might somehow ruin the delicate balance you think you found. And so, you choose silence over truth, hoping that in time, things will naturally fall into place. But the truth does not arrive all at once. It reveals itself in moments, small, almost unnoticeable at first, in the pauses that grow longer, in the effort that feels uneven, in the realization that you are the one holding the weight of something that was never equally carried. And when that awareness finally settles in, it does not come as a loud heartbreak, but as a quiet understanding. What felt like mystery was never meant to be solved, because it was never offering clarity to begin with. And what you once admired as space slowly reveals itself as distance that was never meant to close. At first, it feels refreshing to stand beside someone who seems so whole on their own. They move through life with a sense of independence that is almost magnetic, as though they have mastered the art of needing nothing and no one too deeply. You admire it. It feels mature, grounded, even inspiring. There is no desperation in them, no clinging, no urgency to define or label what is unfolding between you. And in a world where love can often feel overwhelming, their calm distance feels like safety. They show you just enough to keep your heart open. A thoughtful word here, a meaningful glance there, small gestures that suggest there is something real beneath their composed exterior. But it is never too much, never enough to fully rest in. And somehow, that balance keeps you leaning in. You begin to believe that this is what strength looks like in love, that restraint is wisdom, that emotional space is a sign of security. But slowly, the edges of that independence begin to sharpen. What once felt like self-assurance starts to feel like separation. You notice that when moments call for emotional presence, they retreat instead. When conversations deepen, they shift away. When closeness begins to grow, something in them quietly resists it. And you find yourself standing there, holding space for a connection that never fully meets you. You try to understand it in gentle ways. You tell yourself they are just cautious, that they have learned to protect their peace, that maybe they simply love differently. And so you adjust. You soften your expectations, quiet your needs, and convince yourself that patience will bring you closer to them. But what you are really doing is learning how to live with less than what your heart recognizes as real. There is a loneliness that begins to form even in their presence, not because they are absent in body, but because they remain just out of reach in spirit. You can sit beside them, talk with them, even share moments that seem meaningful, yet still feel a distance that cannot be named easily. It is not loud, not dramatic. It is subtle, steady, and deeply unsettling. And the hardest part is that nothing feels clearly wrong. There is no clear break, no defining moment that tells you to walk away, just a growing awareness that something essential is missing. That connection should not feel like something you are constantly trying to earn or unlock. That love, even in its quietest form, should still feel like it meets you halfway. In time, you begin to see that what you once admired was not simply independence. It was a carefully maintained distance from vulnerability. And while independence can be beautiful, it cannot replace emotional presence. It cannot hold you in moments of doubt, cannot reassure you in silence, cannot build something that requires two hearts to be fully open. And when that realization settles in, it changes the way you see everything. You stop mistaking absence for strength. You stop calling distance space just to make it easier to stay. And somewhere within that clarity, you begin to understand that love was never meant to feel like standing alone beside someone who refuses to truly stand with you. There comes a phase where everything begins to feel like a pattern, though no one has named it yet. It is not steady enough to feel secure, yet not broken enough to walk away from. Instead, it moves forward, then back, like a tide that refuses to choose the shore. One moment, they are close, fully present in a way that softens all your doubts. Their words feel intentional, their energy warm, their attention undivided. And just when your heart begins to settle into that closeness, they pull away, not with explanation, but with silence that lingers longer than it should. At first you tell yourself it is temporary. People get busy, emotions take time. You offer understanding before questions, patience before concern. But as it happens again and then again, you begin to feel the rhythm of it. The closeness is never quite long enough to build something steady, and the distance is never quite clear enough to fully let go. So you remain in between, trying to hold on to something that keeps shifting in your hands. And in this dance, you begin to change without realizing it. You become more attentive to their moods than your own needs. You start measuring your words, wondering if asking for clarity will push them further away. You celebrate the moments they come close, not noticing how little it takes to reassure you now. What once would have felt like the bare minimum begins to feel like something worth holding on to. There is a quiet tension in always wondering where you stand. You replay conversations, searching for certainty in sentences that were never meant to provide it. You analyze pauses, read into tones, and try to make sense of something that keeps rewriting itself. And the more you try to understand it, the more you find yourself caught in a cycle that offers just enough to keep you there, but never enough to feel at peace. What makes this so difficult to recognize is that the connection itself is not entirely absent. When they are present, it feels real, it feels genuine. Those moments are not imagined, they are felt deeply, and that is what gives them power. But consistency is what turns moments into something meaningful, and without it, even the most beautiful experiences begin to feel uncertain. Over time, you may start to believe that this is simply how love works, that it is meant to feel unpredictable, that connection naturally comes with confusion. But love does not ask you to constantly question its presence. It does not build itself on a foundation of guessing and waiting. What you are experiencing is not depth, it is inconsistency dressed in moments of intensity. And as this awareness begins to take shape, something within you grows quieter but stronger. You begin to see that this dance has no natural ending, no point where it suddenly becomes stable on its own, because it was never about timing or circumstance. It was about a pattern that repeats until someone chooses to step out of it. And in that realization, you are faced with a choice: to continue moving to a rhythm that keeps you uncertain, or to honor the part of you that longs for something steady, something clear, something that does not disappear the moment it begins to feel real. There is a kind of strength that looks unshakable from the outside, the kind that makes a person seem grounded, composed, and entirely in control of their world. They carry themselves with certainty, speak with calm assurance, and reveal very little that might suggest fragility. And at first, this feels safe to witness, like standing beside someone who will never fall apart, someone who knows how to hold life together without asking for anything in return. It draws you in because it feels steady, dependable, almost admirable in its quiet resilience. But strength, when it is used as a shield, begins to tell a different story, not loudly, not in ways that are easy to point to, but in the spaces where something real should exist and does not. You notice it in the moments that call for openness, when conversations brush against deeper truths and suddenly shift away. You feel it when emotions rise to the surface, and instead of being met, they are gently redirected, softened, or avoided altogether. It is not rejection in the obvious sense, it is absence in places where presence matters most. And so, you begin to sense that what appears as strength may actually be something more guarded, that behind the calm exterior is not a lack of feeling, but a fear of revealing it, a fear that vulnerability might unravel the very identity they have worked so hard to maintain. Because to be open is to risk being seen fully, and to be seen fully is to risk being hurt in ways they may have known before. You try to meet them there in that quiet space where honesty could live. You offer your own openness, hoping it will feel like an invitation rather than a threat. You choose your words carefully, your tone gently, your presence consistently. But vulnerability cannot be borrowed, it has to be chosen. And no matter how safe you try to make the space, if they are not ready to step into it, the distance remains. What makes this so difficult is that their care may still exist. It shows in subtle ways, in actions that suggest they do value you, that you are not invisible to them. But care without openness creates a connection that feels incomplete. You can feel that something is there, yet you cannot fully reach it. It is like standing at the edge of a door that never quite opens, no matter how patiently you wait. And over time, you begin to carry more than your share of emotional weight. You become the one who expresses, who reassures, who tries to deepen what is kept at the surface. You hold space not only for your own feelings, but for the ones they refuse to name, and in doing so, you slowly drift away from the kind of connection that allows two people to stand equally seen. There is a quiet realization that begins to settle in, that strength should not mean emotional distance. That true strength is not found in how well someone can hide their fears, but in their willingness to face them, to speak them, to let themselves be known even when it feels uncertain. Because without that openness, love has no place to land, no way to grow beyond something partial and restrained. And when you finally understand this, you stop trying to decode their silence as something meaningful. You stop calling their walls strength just to make them easier to accept. You begin to see that vulnerability is not a weakness to be avoided, but the very thing that allows love to become real. And without it, no matter how strong someone appears, the connection will always remain just out of reach. There comes a moment when you begin to notice that what you are feeling is no longer simple affection. It is something far more consuming, far more confusing. It is not steady, not grounded, yet it holds you in a way that feels difficult to explain. The warmth you receive arrives unexpectedly, sometimes in fleeting words, sometimes in brief closeness that feels so genuine it quiets every doubt you once had. And in those moments, everything feels real again. You feel chosen, seen, even if only for a while. But it never stays long enough to become something you can rest in. The distance returns just as quietly as the closeness arrived, and with it comes a subtle ache you begin to recognize all too well. You find yourself thinking about what changed, replaying the last conversation, searching for clues that might explain why the warmth faded. And though no clear answer appears, you hold on to the memory of how it felt when they were close, convincing yourself that it will return again if you just remain patient. This is where affection begins to feel addictive, not because it is constant, but because it is unpredictable. It comes in small, powerful doses, just enough to keep your heart invested, just enough to remind you of what could be, without ever fully becoming it. And without realizing it, you begin to crave those moments. You wait for them. You measure time by their presence and absence, allowing their inconsistency to shape your emotional world. You start adjusting yourself in quiet ways. You become more forgiving of the silence, more accepting of the distance, because you know what it feels like when they come back close. You tell yourself that those moments are proof of something real, something worth holding on to. But what you are holding on to is not consistency, it is possibility. And possibility, no matter how beautiful, cannot sustain you on its own. There is a quiet exhaustion that begins to settle in, not the kind that comes from conflict, but the kind that comes from emotional uncertainty, from always hoping, always waiting, always trying to understand something that never fully explains itself. And yet, even in that exhaustion, a part of you resists letting go because you have felt the highs, and they felt too real to dismiss. But love is not meant to feel like something you have to recover from in between moments of joy. It is not meant to leave you searching for balance after every brief sense of closeness. Real affection does not arrive in fragments that leave you wanting more. It builds, it stays, it gives you something steady to stand on. And as this realization begins to take hold, you start to see the pattern for what it is. Not a deep, complicated love that requires endless patience, but a cycle that keeps you attached without ever fully meeting you. You understand that what feels intense is not always what is true, and what feels rare is not always what is right. And in that understanding, something within you begins to shift. The craving softens, the waiting loses its hold, because you begin to recognize that you deserve a kind of affection that does not come and go like a passing feeling, but one that remains clear and certain without making you question whether it will disappear again. There is a point in this experience where confusion stops feeling like a temporary state and starts feeling like the relationship itself. You no longer know where love ends and emotional absence begins because both arrive wearing the same face at different times. One moment there is warmth, attention that feels intentional, presence that feels grounding, words that make you believe you are understood. And in that moment, you call it love without hesitation, because it feels too real to question. But then, without warning, that presence fades into something quieter, something harder to name. It is not an argument, not a separation, not a clear departure. It is simply a shift into distance. Messages become shorter, responses slower, emotional availability thinner, until you are left interacting with someone who feels partially there but not fully with you. And still, you do not have a clean line between what is love and what is absence because both are coming from the same person. This is where the mind begins to work harder than the heart should have to. You start interpreting silence as space, and space as normal, and normal as something you should adjust to. You remember the moments when they were fully present, and you use those memories to justify the moments when they are not. It becomes a cycle of emotional comparison, holding the intensity of closeness against the emptiness of distance, trying to convince yourself that both belong to the same definition of love. But deep down, something begins to feel off. Love is supposed to create clarity, not constant interpretation. It is supposed to settle the nervous system, not keep it in a state of quiet alertness. Yet here, you find yourself constantly reading between lines that were never fully written, searching for reassurance in gaps that never promise certainty. And over time, this becomes exhausting in a way that is difficult to explain to anyone who is not living it. The most confusing part is that emotional absence does not always feel like rejection. Sometimes it arrives gently, almost politely, wrapped in words that still sound caring, actions that still look familiar. And because of that, you hesitate to call it what it is. You question your own perception instead. You wonder if you are asking for too much, expecting too much, feeling too deeply. And in that questioning, you begin to shrink your emotional needs just to keep the connection intact. What makes this even more binding is the return of closeness after distance. Just when you begin to accept the absence, warmth reappears. A message that feels thoughtful, a moment of attention that feels personal, a brief sense of being emotionally seen again. And in that return, everything you questioned begins to dissolve. You tell yourself it was only temporary, that maybe you misunderstood, that maybe love just moves differently here. But over time, the pattern becomes clearer than the moments. Love that keeps needing to be rediscovered is not the same as love that is consistently present. Emotional absence does not lose its impact just because it is interrupted by closeness. And slowly you begin to realize that what you have been calling love is actually a cycle of presence and withdrawal that keeps your heart engaged but never fully secure. And in that realization, confusion starts to lose its power, because once you can see the difference between being loved and being intermittently reached for, you can no longer unsee it. There is a quiet turning point in these kinds of connections, one that does not announce itself loudly, but changes everything in subtle, irreversible ways. It often begins after moments that felt deeply personal, when something honest was shared, when closeness briefly softened the distance between two people. In those moments, it feels as though a door has finally opened, even if only slightly. There is warmth in it, a sense of being understood, a fragile kind of trust that makes everything seem possible again. But what follows is rarely what the heart expects. After intimacy, instead of more openness, there is often retreat. Not always immediate, not always obvious, but gradual enough to confuse certainty. The emotional space that once felt briefly shared begins to feel guarded again, as though something in that closeness triggered a need to step back, to rebuild what was momentarily lowered. And so the silence that follows is not empty, it is constructed, carefully, quietly, almost instinctively. You begin to notice it in the smallest ways. Conversations that once carried ease now feel measured again. Responses that were once warm become careful, shorter, less emotionally available. The rhythm changes, but not in a way that can easily be questioned. Because nothing is openly wrong, you are left interpreting what is unspoken, filling in gaps that no one has acknowledged. And this is where the walls begin to rise again, not in a dramatic shift, but in a quiet reconstruction. After every moment where emotional closeness slips through, something inside them pulls it back into structure. It is as if vulnerability creates a temporary opening, and once it is felt, there is an instinct to restore distance, not out of cruelty, but out of protection. But the effect on you is still the same. You are left outside of something you were briefly invited into, trying to understand why closeness cannot seem to stay. What makes this so difficult to navigate is that the intimacy was real. It was not imagined. It was not one-sided. There were moments when connection was felt on both sides, when the emotional space between you softened enough to feel almost natural. And because of that, the withdrawal does not feel like rejection in the traditional sense. It feels like loss without explanation, like something that existed but refuses to remain. Over time, you start adjusting to this rhythm without fully realizing it. You become more careful with your own openness, more hesitant with your honesty, because you begin to associate vulnerability with distance that follows. You learn slowly and quietly that the deeper the moment, the higher the silence that may come after it. And so you start holding parts of yourself back, not because you want to, but because you are trying to protect what remains of the connection. But emotional connection cannot thrive in cycles of opening and closing without stability. Walls that rise after intimacy do not protect love. They limit it. They turn something meant to expand into something that contracts each time it grows too close to truth. And eventually, you begin to see the pattern for what it is, not a reflection of your worth, not a measure of how deeply you are valued, but a repeated response to closeness that cannot be sustained. And in that understanding, you realize that real connection does not require you to step back after every moment of honesty. It remains present within it, without fear of what openness might reveal. There comes a stage where the connection no longer feels like something shared, but something carried. Not in a dramatic way, not in a moment you can easily point to, but in the slow realization that the emotional weight is no longer distributed equally. One person begins to reach, to initiate, to hold the thread of communication with care and consistency, while the other seems to exist just beyond that effort, present enough to respond, but not present enough to meet it fully. At first, this imbalance is easy to excuse. You tell yourself that people express themselves differently, that energy fluctuates, that not everyone communicates with the same urgency or emotional rhythm, and so you adapt. You become the one who checks in first, who keeps the conversation alive, who bridges the silence before it grows too wide. You do it without resentment in the beginning, because it still feels like connection is there. It just needs a little more patience, a little more understanding. But over time, something subtle begins to change. The effort that once felt natural starts to feel unreturned. You notice that your presence is steady, while theirs feels conditional. They respond, but they rarely reach. They engage, but they seldom initiate. And slowly, without any explicit moment of truth, you begin to feel the shape of something becoming one-sided, not through absence alone, but through the absence of reciprocity. What makes this realization so difficult is that it does not erase the good moments. The warmth still exists in memory. The closeness still has weight. There are still conversations that felt real, still moments that felt mutual, still flashes of connection that remind you why you stayed. And because of that, you continue to believe that balance might return, that effort might eventually be matched, that what feels uneven now is only temporary. So you wait, not passively, but actively. You keep showing up in the same way you always have, hoping consistency will inspire consistency in return. You try not to overthink the silence, not to interpret the distance too quickly. You give space where you feel confusion and understanding where you feel uncertainty. And in doing so, You slowly begin to normalize imbalance as something manageable. But emotional imbalance has a quiet way of shaping the way you feel about yourself. When connection is not returned with the same presence, you start questioning whether your expression is too much, whether your need for clarity is too heavy, whether your effort is something that overwhelms rather than supports. And without noticing, you begin to scale yourself down to fit into a dynamic that is not expanding with you. The drift does not happen in one direction only. It pulls you toward overextension while pulling them further into ease. You begin to exist in a space where you are emotionally reaching upward while they remain comfortably still. And that difference, over time, creates distance not just between two people, but within your own sense of emotional balance. Eventually, clarity begins to surface, not as an ending, but as an awareness. You see that connection is not meant to feel like something you are constantly maintaining alone. It is not meant to rely on your effort as its only source of continuity, because when something is truly mutual, it does not require one person to keep proving it exists. And in that realization, the drift becomes visible for what it is, not a mystery to solve, but an imbalance to recognize. There is a moment that does not arrive with drama or noise, but with a stillness so clear it almost feels like emptiness. It comes after all the trying, all the understanding, all the waiting has been exhausted in quiet ways. You no longer find yourself analyzing every message or holding on to every small gesture as proof of something larger. Instead, you begin to see the shape of the connection as it truly is, without the soft filter of hope that once covered its gaps. At first, this awareness feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because for a long time, absence was something you explained away. You gave it meaning, you gave it context, you gave it patience, you called it timing, you called it fear, you called it individuality in how people love. But when clarity finally settles in, it does not argue with those stories. It simply stands beside them and reveals what has always been consistent beneath all the interpretation. You begin to notice that presence is not something that occasionally visits a healthy connection. It is something that defines it. Not constant perfection, not emotional intensity at every hour, but a steady willingness to remain engaged, even when things are not easy or perfectly aligned. And when that willingness is missing more often than it appears, what you are left with is not a complex form of love, but a partial one that never fully steps into shared space.